My name is Jim Longley. I live here in Yarmouth. I joined the Marine Corps in 1976. It was a difficult decision, but I'm convinced I made the right choice. I was a second-year law student, but really didn't feel like I was making the progress that I wanted to make and felt I wanted to do something different before I finished law school. The Marine Corps recruited me to become a military lawyer, and on August 14th, 1976, I called my father up in the Blaine House in Augusta and said, "Dad, I just want you to know I made a decision. I'm going down to Boston tomorrow to get sworn into the Marine Corps." There was dead silence on the other end of the phone, and after a minute or two, my father said, "I'll put your mother on the line." So it was a tough decision personally. It was a tough decision for my father, but I'm convinced it was the right decision for me and gave me experience that I would never have obtained otherwise. I reported for duty at Quantico, Virginia in June of 1976 for 10 weeks of officer candidate school. The Marine Corps referred to it as platoon leaders class, but it was basically a 10-week mental, spiritual, and physical ordeal. And the training was designed to really measure your individual capabilities and an ability particularly to cope with stress, to be physically up to the challenge, and to have the kind of perseverance and diligence that the Marine Corps was looking for. Initially, my orders called for me to then return to Maine and finish law school, but I made the decision to go straight to the basic officer course, also at Quantico, which was a 6-month course as a brand new second lieutenant. In March of 1977, I received orders as an infantry officer to Okinawa, Japan, and after 2 or 3 weeks of leave, I reported to the 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines. 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines is a very famous Marine Corps Marine Corps battalion. It was one of the 2 battalions that actually was on Corregidor in World War II and unfortunately surrendered to the Philippines. But it had a distinguished record of resistance and also a distinguished record in Vietnam. So once I reported for duty in Okinawa, I was with a temporary battalion, ironically the same battalion that had been involved in the Mayaguez incident a year earlier, where some 10 or 20 Marines had been lost. And so you definitely had a feeling of reality, that the job was serious and you needed to be your best to cope with the responsibilities you were going to be given. But from Okinawa, after leaving 3rd Battalion, 4th Marines, I was sent down to link up with the 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines at Camp Cebu at Subic Bay in the Philippines. We did a 2 or 3 month sea deployment, came back, and at that point I had been with a rifle platoon for about 6 months and was given a staff billet. But before I assumed the staff billet, I was also assigned as an exchange officer with the Japanese Ground Self-Defense Force up in Hokkaido, Japan, and spent a good week with Japanese officers in a Japanese mechanized regiment. It was quite an experience. It was the first international exchange that the Marine Corps had participated in since World War II, and given that it was only 15 or 20 years after World War II, many of the people that we dealt with had personal experiences that obviously were pretty significant. We got back to Okinawa after the assignment in Hokkaido and spent a month up near the demilitarized zone in Korea as a training exercise, but again, we were a readily assignable battalion. Spent the month at the DMZ, went back to Okinawa, later went back to sea again, and then also did another flyaway deployment to Korea, this time to Camp Fuji, Japan, where we spent a month training. Well, on returning from Camp Fuji back to Camp Hansen in Okinawa, basically prepared for a reassignment. In this case, in August of '78, I was assigned as the weapons platoon commander in enlisted instructor company responsible for training new Marine Corps second lieutenants in basic infantry weapons, everything from rifles, machine guns, mortars, to rockets. I left active duty in August of '79 and returned to Maine, where I joined the 1st Battalion, 25th Marines Delta Company, which was a rifle company based in Topsham, Maine, as a platoon commander. I stayed with Delta Company as it transitioned and later became an anti-tank missile platoon for a good 3 years. We trained in fantastic training in Bridgeport, California, in mountain warfare and rock climbing, and also Arctic warfare. We trained as a reserve unit for defense of the Norwegian flank in the event of active hostilities with the Soviet Union. Part of that training was taking 100 Marines up to the SEER, Survival, Evasion, Resistance, and Escape base that the Navy still maintains up in Rangeley, 10 and 20 below zero weather, and training Marines to deal with cold weather and the difficult conditions that go with it. I left active duty for several years, but when Iraqi forces invaded Kuwait, I volunteered for an assignment and was assigned as a public affairs officer for the 25th Marine Regiment. I served with them for 3 months and then worked the media in Boston during the first major reserve call-up in about 50 years in Thanksgiving week in 1990. Later, I was then assigned by name to take charge of the public affairs office at Camp Lejeune in North Carolina, where for 3 months I managed the Marine media effort on a base that had roughly 20,000 Marines assigned in a combat zone, and where we had some 4 gymnasiums set aside for personal effects in the event of casualties. Very serious concerns, very great worries amongst the families, particularly the wives, mostly wives and children that were on the base. And once the ground war was over in Iraq, I was assigned to northern Iraq to link up with the 24th Marine Expeditionary Unit to work with then Colonel Jim Jones and Army Major General Jay Garner on Operation Provide Comfort, which was the United States' humanitarian effort to protect the Kurdish, some 500,000 Kurds in northern Iraq from Iraqi advancement. That was quite an experience also. We literally had 500,000 civilians, from Kurdish nationals, living at 5,000 and 10,000 feet in the mountains trying to escape hostilities from the Iraqi army. That job was a major challenge on my part. It was the #1 news story in the world. We were also debriefing nuclear defectors, and it left quite an impression on me. I returned to Maine in June of 1991, and then continued my assignments with the Marine Corps Media Section, where we developed training tactics and techniques to better utilize our experience, where the media was literally showing up in the middle of a battlefield, during Desert Storm and even in northern Iraq. Continued that assignment, and later was asked to help support training of the new brigadier generals in not just media relations, but also in the responsibilities of Congress in terms of how they should prepare to testify and the kind of relationship they should have with their public officials. One of my fortuitous relationships in the Marine Corps was I worked at a reporting senior, a Major Mike Wiley. Major Wiley is a very well-known Marine, one of the leading reformers in the Marine Corps in the 1980s. And the Marine Corps, for those who aren't aware of it, changed its warfighting doctrine to better utilize information and the ability to maneuver rather than the static old tactics of the past. And Major Wiley was a real trailblazer in that environment, in that challenge, and a real precursor to understanding the role that technology is now playing in society and in the military. And I've carried a lot of that experience forward for the last 30 years in my work working in the technical intelligence community, and understanding that it's one thing to have a capability in the military, but it's something else to understand what the technical capabilities might be and what the capabilities might be if they're changed or the technology is applied to them. And we're seeing that today in all of the discussions about cyber and space. The interesting connection that I had with Mike Wiley, it led to an involvement with an Air Force colonel named John Boyd, who's postulated significant changes in the way militaries today not only fly airplanes, but how they organize for their military service. And he developed what's known as the OODA loop, or a process by which you assess a situation wherein you observe something, you orient your mind to it, you decide what you're going to do to deal with it, and then you act on it. And it's called a loop, when in reality it's 4 different processes that take place at once. And when you look at the history of Desert Storm, and I did this work as a civilian, after I retired in 2004, but as a reservist and then as a civilian, I've been very involved on issues going back to the second Gulf War, the invasion of Iraq, our work in Afghanistan, was very involved in dealing in the Pentagon with the challenges confronting us in the area of improvised explosive devices. And one of the big lessons that I learned was how resistant the bureaucracy is to change. That people become, in government, even well-meaning people, become very accustomed to their existing processes and plans, and are very, even highly reluctant to change them, even in the face of dire circumstances. And that was pretty much the case with IEDs. I had a catbird seat watching those in the Pentagon who were struggling with this challenge and how difficult it was for them to get to the troops the changes in thinking and equipment that were needed. I remember one incident in particular where an office in the Pentagon, and I had begun working with what was called the Joint Threat Technology Coordination Office, that became the IED task force, that became the IED, joint IED effort. And with one of the principles in the early days of the second Iraq War after the invasion, there was a big concern with how the military was dealing with terrorists. And the big concern was that we were not effectively keeping track of people. They'd be apprehended in one part of Iraq, and then they'd show up in another part, but no one would really know that they'd been in 2 different places. And so the military came up with a biometric system. And I can remember being in the Pentagon and in a senior office, listening to the director of the program arguing from Washington with a colonel in Iraq about the need to use the biometric capabilities that had been sent for him to use. And the colonel's argument was, well, why am I using this? These people move around. His perspective was very geocentric to one location, his location. And the director of the program literally shouted back at him that you need to understand these people are moving around the country, and how are you going to track them from your location if they show up in another location? Or if they've shown up in another location, you need the biometric data. That means getting retina scans or fingerprints or other indicators of who you're dealing with so you can identify them. Even today, we have a real challenge in terms of adapting to space and cyber. We've only recently come to understand that our role in outer space is now under serious challenge. In the early days, the assumption was that outer space was so big that you could put a satellite up there and never have to worry about it. Well, today there are thousands of satellites, hundreds of thousands of pieces of debris, maybe even into the hundreds of millions of debris. And a real effort is underway to try to determine how the Pentagon, how the United States, commercial and government, can track these objects in space, and interestingly enough, confront an operational system that has its origins in the 50s, tracking individual missiles. And so, if you will, we've gone from a situation where in the 50s we might be happy to be able to track a single missile on its trajectory, and you have this system that is really oriented towards tracking a single missile. Now all of a sudden you have people that think you can change it to be able to go after thousands of missiles or hundreds of thousands of objects. And obviously it's a challenge that's not going very well, and we need to learn more about it, and I'm very happy to be involved in it. Reflecting on the military experience, it was certainly an incredible personal challenge to get through basic training, basic officer training, and people really were less concerned, and I don't mean this in a way that's disrespectful, but you were treated as an individual, you were respected for what you could do, and your professional duty was superior to what your individual preferences were. And it was interesting to see how the military system separated those two, the personal from the professional. And I think you gain an appreciation for military service. I can best probably say it this way, that going into the military is a little bit like going into a barrel, and you never know where you're going to end up. And we certainly honor those who really got the short end of the stick with casualties and trauma, and you honor their courage and sacrifice. At the same time, you honor everybody's service, but you particularly respect the people who've paid a price for what they've done. And in some ways, we all pay a price because it changes you physically. It affects you professionally not only in your military career, but particularly when you get out. And I've been fortunate enough to gain a lot intellectually in terms of defense and security policy, having learned and framed my professional experience as a Marine officer. And I've got great respect for the Marine Corps, I've got great respect for all the services and what people are asked to do. And it's the level of discipline is something else that's astonishing to watch. I can recall we were training for an infantry battle. I was a weapons company commander, and literally you would coordinate aircraft moving across a battlefield within 10-second windows where men and women in equipment were moving or serving or fighting. So it was a level of detail that very few civilians ever experience. It's not an experience you can soon forget. It really becomes part of you. You know, when I made the decision, and my father really didn't know quite what to say, I think it was difficult for him to understand that I wanted to be evaluated as an individual. I had great respect for his service. He was probably the hardest working governor we've ever had of Maine. He was an independent. He brought a level of honesty and seriousness to the job that I think is rarely duplicated, and had quite a distinguished record in Maine as one of the few states in the country that kept the rate of inflation down, and he brought some major industry into Maine, particularly in the form of Pratt and Whitney down in the Berwicks. But it was, I really wanted to be evaluated on my own merits, and I was up for a challenge, a physical challenge, a mental challenge, and a spiritual challenge. And I say spiritual because there's a level of belief and dedication that is what gets you through the training and what gets you through the service. And you know, the mental part is tough to work under stress, and the physical part is tough to deal with the physical stress that you have to deal with. But I give a lot of credit to the Marine Corps that there's hardly any situation that you get thrown into that you don't somehow have a way of pulling it together and dealing with it. And And I think that's been something that has been a real valuable lesson, very valuable experience for me. It shaped my time in Congress. I was lucky to be elected to represent the 1st District of Maine in 1994. I was part of the first Republican Congress in 40 years. My attitude about my 2 years in Congress, that if you do it right, 2 years is enough. I certainly wasn't happy to lose my seat, but I had no regrets whatsoever that I took some hard decisions, particularly about government spending. In those days, the deficit was roughly $5 trillion, pushing on $6 trillion. As I sit here today, it's pushing $35 trillion, and levels of inflation that we just hope that we can find a way to cap. But I ran into several situations, one in particular involving the military services, where I had to make a tough decision. I was one of 6 members who supported introducing missile defense technology into the Navy. And in all honesty, supporters of the shipyard and the Aegis destroyer program weren't happy. And in so many ways, they tried to convince me that, well, the money is going to come out of the steel budget. And I'm proud to say that 30 years later, that the Navy has overcome its resistance resistance, by the way, was at senior levels of the Navy. Initially, Congress forced the Navy to equip 16 destroyers with missile defense technology. And after several years, they realized that it was absolutely essential, and hat in hand went back to Congress after I had left, actually, to say, well, we need all of our destroyers to have this missile defense capability. And as we're sitting here today, I can take some small pleasure in the Israeli effective use of the Iron Dome program and the effective role that United States Navy destroyers played in the recent attack against Israel, where they downed the drones and downed any number of ballistic missiles using technology that some of us fought for some 20 and 30 years before. It's also interesting to note that even today, the Navy is urgently upgrading the software in these systems, again, that wouldn't be existing if it hadn't been for some of us who pushed for it. There are other decisions I made. You make mistakes sometimes, but by the same token, the system is big. There's a lot of decision points. You give it your best effort, and I'm very proud of my service. Well, once I was commissioned, I was fortunate. I was assigned as what the Marine Corps would refer to as an 0302, which is an infantry officer. And I was very glad to have that, not only that MOS, but to serve in that capacity, and did so for maybe 2 or 3 years. But over the years, particularly as a reservist, you pick up different skills that have applicability to the government or to the military service. And I became a practicing lawyer and received an alternate MOS of a Judge Advocate General. Later, with my service in Desert Storm, I had been put on active duty. Not only had I been a public affairs officer in the reserves for regimental headquarters and dealt with some major media stories, but I had an amount of civilian experience going back to some of my dad's campaign and some of my own work on some referendums here in Maine and political activity, where they, by name, had me assigned as Director of Public Affairs at Camp Lejeune. And that really came in handy when I was assigned to northern Iraq to work with General Garner and Colonel Jones. We were the #1 story in the world. We had 3 nuclear defectors. It was the first time that U.S. Marines had gone anywhere into the central northern area of Iraq. We were the first 400 troops that ended up being part of a 30,000 person occupation. And at one point, we had several situations, including a potential mass grave, nuclear defectors, a lot of serious issues relating to troop movements, Iranian behavior, Iraqi behavior. And having had that experience on the civilian side, I had, candidly, a level of experience that a lot of the regular public affairs officers didn't have. But I earned a public affairs additional MOS. And then later, following my term in Congress, I did a lot of technical work for the United States Army Space and Missile Defense Command and also the Missile Defense Agency. And that civilian experience doubled into some of my work as a reservist, where I had another alternate MOS as an air control officer. So I was very fortunate to, in some ways, be able to serve as a generalist, even with a lot of very specific technical experience in the missile and space field. My assignment at Camp Lejeune had a fair amount of pressure. I ended up, it turns out that the regular active duty media staff had left Camp Lejeune and was in the process of leaving for Saudi Arabia. And I ended up being really the only officer who could talk to the press or work with the press. And it was a little more sensitive and complicated than what might normally have happened in a media relations position, because we had the family members of thousands of Marines, wives, husbands, children, entire school system had parents, one or more parents in a war zone. And so there was enormous sensitivity about the kind of media coverage that was taking place at Camp Lejeune. And it showed. We had several networks show up, and there's a saying in the news media, if it bleeds, it leads. And I have to say that many of the media professionals were sensitive about it, but make no bones about it, they wanted to talk to wives and family members about what it was like to have their husband or wife, I guess, in a war zone. And it was pretty sensitive stuff. And we also knew that what we were doing as a media office and the networks that we were working with were being seen in Iraq. And it copped off with, finally President Bush came down to visit, and to his credit, he spent 2 hours with the pilots' wives, including of several that had been captured. Family members, someone had been captured, and he wouldn't do it. He wouldn't allow media coverage. So he was very well respected by the men and women in the area, in the military. And after the air war wound down, the Kurdish rebellion erupted, and I was tasked to go forward to support a Marine unit that was going in to secure the humanitarian zone. And as fate would have it, myself and a sergeant were at Dover Air Force Base. We're waiting for transit on a Air Force C-5. And I linked up with the special projects team, special technical team from CBS News, which had been on assignment for the Pentagon, and their job was to get to northern Iraq and set up satellite uplink for media coverage, not just CBS, but all the networks. And so, we worked a few deals. We got to Incirlik on a Saturday night. We drove all night to arrive at Zaku, Iraq, or actually Salopi, Turkey. And we set up the uplinks in Turkey, and then turns out it was a Sunday. It was the first full day that the Marines had gone into northern Iraq. And there was a need to do something with the 80 war correspondents that were there, and so my job was to find 15 of them, put them on 2 helicopters, and fly into the country. As fate would have it, I ended up working with the general and being with the general and the first 400 Marines from the first full day of the operation. And it was a stunning for me to learn how advanced many of these correspondents were, how much they understood of what was going on, and how thorough they were, but also they had relationships that even the military didn't have. A little vignette of the kinds of chaos that you're dealing with was that we had television reporters and print reporters who wanted to cover what the Marines and actually there was an Army regiment that was also participating, and special operations people were involved. But they needed transportation, and typically the best way of doing that was helicopters. And when I approached the squadron commander initially on the first full day to say, can I put some reporters on your helicopters, I didn't get at first what one would consider to be a welcome reaction. But after some discussion, the pilots and the squadron leader understood that what we were doing in providing an opportunity to give visibility to what the United States was doing to feed people. There were 20 people a day were dying in the mountains. We had helicopters that couldn't even land when they dropped their food because mothers would throw their babies up to the helicopter. And what we were able to achieve was a working relationship between the pilots of the aircraft and the networks and the reporters, wherein they could share information on an appropriate basis. And the families of the soldiers and Marines could see evidence of what their family members were doing in Iraq, in northern Iraq, on a humanitarian mission. And at the same time, the mission was enhanced. Visibility of the mission was enhanced, and visibility was a major objective because people in the world needed to know what we were doing. We weren't occupying northern Iraq, we were trying to feed people. And one of the greatest credits that I think I received was later General Jones, Commandant and a NATO commander, mentioned to several other officers that he felt I wrote the book on press coverage of a humanitarian operation, and I was very proud of that. You know, I think one of the factors that frankly people tend to overlook is that the media played a very valuable role. They publicized what the United States was doing. We had a completely transparent approach. In many ways, the fact that we were allowing our media to cover our operation changed the behavior of the Iraqi army. And I can remember the first couple of days, these Iraqi special police would be sauntering down the streets of a nearly deserted Zaku, Iraq. And the only people who would come out on the streets would be the kids. Those adults that were remaining were in hiding. And working with General Garner, we made a decision to actually bring the news media into the center of Zaku, with the result that the Iraqis withdrew their special police, and the adults in the town understood that the United States was there to provide protection and that they could depend on us, and it totally changed the character of the operation. And not to mention, there is a lot of pressure on the military and on the family members, and the family members had an opportunity to learn more about what their husbands and wives and mothers and fathers were doing in the middle of this mission. And again, we accomplished a lot. We fed a lot of people. We saved a lot of lives. One of the interesting aspects of my experience in northern Iraq was officially I was in a combat zone. I'd prefer to maybe label it as a war zone. We went in under arms. We were heavily armed. We had artillery. We had every fighter cover. We had every bit of hardware at our disposal. But largely, the Iraqi army had been pacified. I carried a sidearm, and there were several situations where something was happening around us, or we had to be careful maybe about mines or things that were in the ground. I actually, my first day in northern Iraq, the general took me in his helicopter, and we overflew a number of Iraqi military gun positions. And when I talk gun positions, I'm talking about 122 millimeter artillery pieces that had stacks of empty shells next to them, and the barrels were all pointed at the refugees in the mountains in northern Iraq. To be honest, I was lucky it wasn't active combat, but at the same time, I have to say I was prepared for it. And in training, I had a number of situations where it probably was in more danger based on fire directions and mistakes that people made with either loose rounds or mortar shells or rockets that were being fired, and not always in the best manner. But you learn to deal with what you have to deal with. And I'm very fortunate for the training. The training was actually worse than what I had to deal with in northern Iraq, or more of a challenge, I guess is the best way to put it. I think, following my service in Desert Storm, the Marine Corps was very concerned about how the news media could interfere or get in the middle of combat operations. And it was a really serious problem, because if you're an infantryman or you're on security duty and something or someone shows up unexpected, it's potentially a moment of crisis. I can recall that after we'd been in northern Iraq, one of our major objectives was to start moving the 500,000 people in the mountains to a refugee camp that was down lower altitude in the town, near the town of Zaku, Iraq. And as we're loading up the helicopters with working parties, we're going up into the mountains, and we show up, and there is a CNN crew that was there before us. And I had another instance where I'm at a briefing on actually literally the first night that I was in country, and I was there on the first full day of the Marine occupation. The general was briefing that our intelligence people were going to be meeting with the leaders of the Kurdish guerrilla movement. And there are aspects of this that don't always make it into the newspapers, a lot of subtleties and nuances that get dealt with on the ground that are significant, that people in Washington just have no idea about, and if they do, they generally don't understand it or make mistakes. But so he's lets me know, he's briefing everybody that the intelligence team is due to meet with these leaders. So in the back of my head, I say, okay, Longley, make sure you keep your news media away from this particular meeting that's going to take place. Well, I didn't know where the meeting was, and as chance would have it, I showed up in the refugee camp with 15 international journalists, New York Times, Washington Post, Associated Press, print, radio, electronic television, and we're at one spot in a kind of a triangle, and to my left is an intelligence team, and to my right are the leaders of the Kurdish movement. And there's me with 15 international journalists. And I'm thinking to myself, well, I don't want to necessarily say what I was saying to myself, but I have to share with you that not only was the intelligence team dumbfounded, all of my reporters, most of my reporters, knew the leaders of the Kurdish guerrilla movement, and our intelligence team didn't. And so it was almost like Old Home Week, but I have to say that very quickly got ourselves out of the middle of that. But it was a real message about the sources of information and the limits of our government's ability sometimes to understand a situation. And needless to say that many of these reporters had been in the mountains with the leaders of the Kurdish guerrilla movement, actually leaders of Kurdistan, both civilian and their quasi-military people. They knew them better than we did. You know, it's an interesting question why I joined the Marines, and it really comes down to some interesting moments. I can remember being in the second grade, and we lived in Cumberland at the time, and we're driving from up Blanchard Road onto Tuttle Road, and as we're coming up Tuttle Road to getting close to Route 88, there was a Navy blimp in the air. And in the late 50s, the Navy used blimps for anti-submarine warfare. And it fascinated me to see that airship floating around. And over time, I came to appreciate that the Naval Air Station was in Brunswick. Later in high school, I remember a demonstration by a team of Marine recruiters. And in all honesty, they made an impression with their discipline, and they were demonstrating some judo and whatnot. But again, that wasn't anything I thought seriously about. A real defining moment for me in picking the Marine Corps is I was a junior, I think, at Holy Cross, and this was right in the early 70s when the Vietnam War protests were really heating up. And a number of recruiters would obviously visit college campuses, you know, Army, Air Force, Navy, Marines, et cetera. But the administration of the school wasn't very keen on having military recruiters on campus. In fact, there'd been significant disruption on the campus. Well, to the Marines' credit, they insisted on coming. And the administration accommodated them by putting them behind a table in the middle of a ballroom where for 8 or 10 hours, these Marines endured taunts and catcalls from some 100 or 200 demonstrators. Now, with all due respect, most of the demonstrators were quiet and didn't say very much, but there were some holding up signs of, various signs of protest that weren't very respectful, and the Marines kept their professional composure. So that demonstration, if you will, made a big impact, had a big impact on my thinking, where on a professional basis, I absolutely respected a service that was willing to stand up for its values. And when you get right down to it, the Marine Corps standards when it comes to physical fitness, and ironically, technology and technical innovation is amongst the highest. And the Marine Corps has been on the cutting edge of a lot of technologies in its history, going back to helicopters, even drones, and more immediately changes in the nature of warfare. And again, innovations that are important to the country, but important to the Marines and to the success of the operations they might engage in. The personnel were extremely high quality. I was very lucky to serve with people that later retired at senior positions in the intelligence community and also in the military. And a lot of respect for the work they did and the challenges they faced. And not all of them were a lot of difficult challenges. Periodically, I'd come back and visit, but I was overseas for 16 months, and then in Virginia for a year. And when I had leave, I'd come back up to Maine, and then, of course, came back to finish my last year of law school. I know I can't speak for the other services, but I can say that in the Marines, they do a very good job of preparing you for what I would call a lot of unusual, even adverse circumstances. And your ability to cope with difficulty is very high on their priority list. And again, one of the things that a lot of people don't understand is you can be in the best physical shape, you can be smart as a whip, but if emotionally and spiritually you don't have your act together, they're not comfortable keeping you in the military. They need people that have the mental resilience, the spiritual resilience to deal with difficulty. And sometimes you have difficulty. It varies between people. And as I said earlier, as I've said at times, going into the military is a little bit like going into a barrel. A lot of men and women do it. A lot of them come out very successfully. A lot of them don't come out, and a lot of them have real serious challenges that they have to face as a result of it. But you've got great respect for everybody, and especially those who either pay the price or have served in some of the more difficult circumstances. I think the military prepares you for a recognition of, I guess the best way to describe it is a recognition of reality. And we don't, if there's a challenge that all of us face, is sometimes it's understanding what is really happening around us or to us, or how are we really conducting ourselves. We don't always get the kind of feedback that we want. But I think having had the experience in the military, I personally bring a different level of seriousness to the political process, and particularly the role of government. And I find that I'm impatient with people that try to take a shortcut. And there is no shortcut. These situations are difficult, and you need to respect the fact that individuals ultimately are responsible for how they conduct themselves. But you need to understand that you can't micromanage everything they're doing. But having said that, a big part of my work over the last 30 years in the technical world, largely technical intelligence, but advanced technology ranging from missiles and lasers and various types of weaponry and aircraft and spacecraft, is that there's a difference between the sales process that takes place in the government and how the capabilities of those products are actually measured or identified. And a very simple way to explain this is that in Desert Storm, one of our big successes was called precision targeting. And there's a whole school of thought about what's called precision navigation and targeting, particularly using GPS technology. We tend to, as Americans, in our military, if there's a shortfall, we tend to think of the weaponry before we think of the technology. And so a lot of our approach to IT and digital thinking, digital capabilities, has been to improve existing weaponry and actually go to considerable lengths to think we can improve legacy capabilities, legacy technologies. The reality is that when you look at precision weaponry, it's not so much about the weaponry as it is the IT system that supports it. And how do you use that IT capability? How do you manage the security of the cyber links, the spacecraft that go into it? And are you really using your imagination when it comes to how those capabilities are being used? The rigor of the evaluation process is definitely a factor in how a military officer would approach a situation. And in a case of my civilian work, working with advanced technology, we were asked by the Director of National Intelligence, the Science and Technology Office, to conduct an outreach effort with the private sector over a range of intelligence investment priorities involving technology. And we structured an outreach effort involving, ultimately over 5 or 6 years, involved upwards of 500, 600 government and industry subject matter experts. And it was a challenge getting the business people, the industry people, and the government people to leave their existing programs and products at the door and to approach the science with a white paper attitude. And I'm proud that we were able to largely create new capabilities, new investment priorities based on what I would call a raw understanding of the state of technology, and less favoring product A or B that a company might be trying to sell, or a program B or C that a government agency might be trying to fund. There's enormous pressure in Washington for money, and business is looking for it, industry is looking for it, government's looking for it. Candidly, I think it's way out of control, and there's a need to restore to basic science, basic ethics, in terms of the way we conduct ourselves in this area. And I wouldn't have learned that without my military experience. Well, I was a reservist, so my duty was in D.C., but I had an apartment down there. And so I've been living in Yarmouth. Ironically, I got a house here thinking I would be flying out of Portland, but ended up flying out of Manchester. But we're still in the same house. I have great respect for those who've served in the military, and as the saying goes, I've kind of given it the office, but I'm a proud life member of the AMVETS, of the American Legion, and the Veterans of Foreign Wars, and support the work that they do. I think it's really important. I mean, leaving the military is a culture shock. The experiences that you've had, you most likely will never come close to the scale of interest and experience and excitement and even esteem in the civilian world that you lived with in the military. And yes, service is a real aspect of dignity and deserves respect. And I think sometimes you're making a big mistake if you don't find a way to get affiliated with a veterans group, find fellow veterans, and if you need to use the VA or associate with the VA, that's tremendous. There are a number of different groups connected with different conflicts going back to Korea, Vietnam, Desert Storm, the Second Iraqi War, Afghanistan, the war on terror, the pressure that people face, a lot of times the difficulty of the experience that they had to endure, or that they've suffered. They're not alone. They need to know that there are others that have been in that same position. One of my fortunate opportunities after Desert Storm was I was brought back to Washington to help design the media strategy for training new officers. And I'm glad to say that the training was really focused on getting across to new lieutenants, especially small unit leaders, that you could be anywhere in a combat environment or in a difficult military environment, and a reporter could show up, or a camera crew, and how do you deal with this person? And I'm glad to say that we had a situation in Somalia several months after Desert Storm where there was a Marine unit guarding an airfield in Somalia, and they were positioned with anti-tank weapons to be able to defend that airfield. And there was a utility vehicle that came careening across the runway towards this Marine position. And they literally were lining up an anti-tank missile on this vehicle. And at the last second, the lieutenant said, "Cease fire." And it turns out it was a news crew from ABC News. But for the fact that there was some specter or flicker of awareness, could have been an unfathomable tragedy. I also was asked to work on some of the military reunions from the 50th anniversary of World War II. And one of them in particular was I organized the media coverage and the ceremony for the 50th anniversary of the veterans of the Battle of Guadalcanal. And some 600 veterans from that initial conflict in the Pacific came to Washington. They were feted. They had special ceremonies. President Bush, the first President Bush, appeared. And we had a special evening parade at the Marine Barracks in Washington for these men. And it's worth noting that the average Marine on Guadalcanal probably lost 20 or 30 or more pounds. And they didn't come off the line, didn't come off the fighting lines unless their temperature pushed 104 degrees. The battle and the malaria, the disease, the ferocity of the enemy was something unfathomable. And the fact that they survived it and prevailed was certainly worth commemorating 50 years later in Washington, D.C. with the President of the United States. I might add that it was also affected by, you have casual relationships, people that might have been in the service. I have to say that there are young men that I've counseled, that young men and women. One in particular, I'm down at Camp Lejeune, and we're maybe 2 or 3 weeks into the air war, and a plane goes down. Two P-3s went down off the coast of California on a training mission, and one of the co-pilots was a young man that I had spoken to several years earlier about going into the Navy. So, and I also recall my dad had been president of his class at Lewiston High School, the class of 1941. My father went into the Army Air Corps when he was drafted, but one of his classmates, the vice president of his class, was a young man who went into the Marine Corps, and he is still one of the missing from the Battle of Guadalcanal, some 80 years later. So you think about that, you think about these people, and it certainly makes an impression on you. I think one of the other factors, you learn about the military, you learn about the blimps that the Navy has, but again, people matter, and I can recall my dad discussing, first of all, my grandfather was a veteran of World War I. He was in the Yankee Division, 18 months in Europe, 6 major battles, every major battle that the Yankee Division was in. He was a trench mortarman and a bugler. And in the family folklore is that He may have later suffered from some of the conditions he experienced, and he died at a young age. I think he was 43 or 44. My father had a classmate in high school. My father was the president of his class at Lewiston High School, and the vice president was a young man named Norm Dion. My father later would go into the Army Air Corps, but Norm enlisted in the Marines, and it turns out he was the first casualty, the first veteran soldier from Lewiston that died in World War II. And he was part of a group of 10 or 15 people, and they're still missing 80 years later. But Norm Dion died on Guadalcanal. Growing up, very friendly, went to school with the McMorrow family. A young man named Jimmy McMorrow was a classmate ahead of me at Lewiston High School. Jimmy died as a Marine in Vietnam. I think service is honorable. I think there's a great opportunity to learn. The military is aggressive with sending young men and women to schools. You definitely will have some independence and be on your own, and it won't necessarily be a day at the beach, as they say. But if you're careful, work with a recruiter, do your homework, find out what schools you might qualify for, where you're going to be sent. Assess the character of the people that you're dealing with, the recruiters especially, and do your homework. There are great opportunities, and if you're out of high school, there are plenty of opportunities both in schooling in the military, but also, I know the Marine Corps especially, and I think the Air Force and Army are the same. They're looking to identify enlisted talent that they can send to further school, including paying for college and having them serve later as an officer or go to one of the academies. So it's a responsibility on your part, on the part of a potential volunteer, to really do the homework, understand what you're getting into, and whether it's right for you or not. It will definitely change your perspective on life and on the world. And you need to understand, you need to be willing to learn, I guess. And if you resent it or if you have a problem really accepting the fact that you would be subject to the leadership of others, you're probably best not doing it. But if you've got some self-discipline, if you want to advance yourself, if you want an experience that will teach you something for the rest of your life, that you'll live with for the rest of your life, and yes, an experience that could very well have a risk. Sometimes you got to, take one day at a time. Or as the saying goes, we've only got one life to live, and if you do it right, one life is enough. I think it's worth understanding that you have to make choices in life, and you've got to decide, are you happy with what you're doing now? Are you happy with the path you're on? Are you on a path? Are you struggling with where or what you want to do in life? And understand the military can offer opportunities. It also comes with some risk, particularly depending on the kind of service that you may be considering. There's a saying that you only have one life to live. If you do it right, one life is enough. But at the same time, for some people that are in the military, they only have one life to live, and it isn't enough because it's cut short, or there's a price that's paid, and that's a risk that we all take. We could walk down the street and get hit by a car, or be in an accident, or find out that we're on the path of a drunk driver. So risk is everywhere, and I just think you got to have the courage and think about the courage that you might want to bring to the equation to do something that you could benefit from if it's right for you. But again, do your homework. I think if there's one thing one thought that you have when you leave the service, when you get off active duty, is that it is a difficult experience for a lot of people. And for everybody, it's about challenge. It's not about avoiding challenge, at least for most people. And I think that a lot of times I wish that there were more understanding of the nuances of military involvement, of the kinds of decisions that people need to make, hard decisions in a combat environment or in a military environment or in a national environment. We read the paper every day. We read about what's happening overseas. We read about the terrorism. We read about aggression, conflicts, et cetera. And it's not as simple sometimes as you read in the paper or hear in the news media. And it's worth paying some attention to the history, learning a little bit about what's going on, but also giving the benefit of the doubt sometimes to the people that have to make decisions about what it is that we're doing. It's not always easy to make a decision, and it's not always going to be the right decision, but decisions have to be made, and understanding that, I think, is a big step for everybody, and it would do a lot to improve the social fabric that we're all living with.